It began about 1:30 the afternoon of November 21st, the president's trip to Texas. 5,000 persons were at the San Antonio International Airport. Teletypes began relaying the story from the edge of the parking ramp even before the presidential jets sat down. Then it was there, and the crowd surged in anticipation. San Antonians had last seen the president during the 1960 campaign. His two visits to Texas since his election had been to Houston and El Paso. Accompanied by Mrs. Kennedy, her first trip to Texas, the president smiled broadly as he left. His mission was to dedicate the School of Aerospace Medicine at Brooks Air Force Base. 125,000 persons lined the route of the presidential motorcade, waiting to see the chief executive and Mrs. Kennedy. In less than 24 hours, Kennedy would be dead, Governor Connally wounded. Next stop on the scheduled three-day tour was Houston. Flags and other souvenirs were sold to crowds at the airport. Signs welcoming the president and the first lady were hoisted. The trip was said to be non-political. Political strategists knew it was anything but that. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram's Washington correspondent, Robert Hilburn, wrote that the trip might decide how Texas would vote in 1964, that the president had to see for himself if he really was in as bad shape in Texas as he'd been told. Vice President Lyndon Johnson, a Texan who would be president the next day, was to host the Kennedys at his ranch near Johnson City Friday night. In Houston, the president attended a testimonial dinner for Congressman Albert Thomas, U.S. Representative for 27 years. Mr. Kennedy's speech looked to the future. More water, more schools, more housing. A future in which this, the youngest American ever elected president, appeared destined to play an historic role. Late that night at Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth, souvenir signs were being sold for 75 cents. The base was thrown open to the public, and some 6,000 gathered on the flight line to welcome the fourth president to visit Fort Worth in the city's 114-year history. Kennedy in 1964, Goldwater in 1864 read some of the signs. Air Force Number 1, the presidential jet, touched down at 11:07 p.m., arriving from Houston 22 minutes behind schedule. There were cheers in the night, and Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce President Raymond Buck shouted over the noise, "Welcome to Fort Worth, Mr. President." The president replied, "I'm happy to be here, happy to see all of these people." The vice president was still a sidebar to the story. There was little film taken of him and of Governor Connally as the cameramen and the crowds concentrated on the president and Mrs. Kennedy. Fort Worth skyline was lighted especially for the occasion. The welcome sign was out at Hotel Texas, where the chief executive spent the night. An estimated 4,000 persons were clustered outside the hotel entrance. The president and the first lady left their convertible. Plans called for them to enter the hotel immediately, but the president and Mrs. Kennedy walked across the street to shake hands with those they could reach. A reporter asked, "What do you think of the Texas crowds, Mr. President?" "They're wonderful, wonderful," Mr. Kennedy replied. From the crowd, voices shouted, "God bless you, Mr. President. We love you, Mr. President." "Welcome, Mr. President," read the Star-Telegram headline. Kennedy and the First Lady entered the hotel and retired for the night in Suite 850. Before dawn, the morning of November 22nd, people began to gather on the parking lot across the street from the hotel where the president was scheduled to make an appearance. Light rain was falling from a gray sky, and nearly everyone wore raincoats, including police officers stationed atop nearby buildings. Shortly before 9, the crowd had swelled to more than 8,000. Some of them had been standing in the rain 3 hours. Bareheaded and without a raincoat, the vigorous young chief executive left the hotel and headed for the crowds he loved so well.
The President of the United States. But we appreciate your welcome. This city's been a great western city. The defense of the West, travel, oil, and all the rest. Just believe in the strength of this city, and strength of this state, and strength of this country. Did you come to see Jackie or the President?
I came to see the President, and I said to the President, God bless you, and I met him.
More than 2,000 persons were waiting for the President's appearance at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast in the hotel's grand ballroom. He was given a prolonged ovation, but it failed to match the response to Mrs. Kennedy's entrance. She was wearing a bright pink suit with a blue collar. In less than 4 hours, the suit was stained with her husband's blood. And the President captivated the crowd with his easy charm and good humor.
2 years ago, I said that, introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting that same sensation as I travel around Texas. Nobody wonders what Lyndon and I wear.
Couldn't let you leave Fort Worth without providing you with some protection against the rain.
I'll put it on in the White House on Monday. If you'll come up there, you'll have a chance to see it there.
Downtown Fort Worth was alive with cheering crowds when the presidential motorcade left the hotel for Carswell Air Force Base and the 30-mile trip by jet to Dallas. The President and Mrs. Kennedy rode in a convertible with Governor and Mrs. Connally. By this time, the sun was out, and all along their route there were cheering crowds, including hundreds of students who were dismissed from classes so they might see the President. Although they were behind schedule, the President and Mrs. Kennedy once more went into the crowd to shake hands with scores of well-wishers. Handshakes that will be treasured by the lucky ones in the jubilant, cheering crowd.